June 1943. The rumble of wheels echoed through the quiet American countryside as a long troop train carried a dozen grey-uniformed figures across unfamiliar terrain. These were not victorious soldiers returning home, nor were they celebrating some battlefield triumph. They were prisoners of war, captured soldiers from North Africa, weary, wounded, and burdened with uncertainty. Each face pressed against a foggy window held a mix of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. For months, they had endured the merciless desert campaigns, fought under the relentless sun, and witnessed the horrors of combat. Now, far from home and thousands of miles from the front lines, they were about to confront a reality they could never have imagined. Whispers traveled along the cramped cars. What would happen once they stepped onto American soil? In Germany, they had been told stories of brutality, of harsh treatment, meagre rations, and merciless guards. They had been taught to fear their enemies, to expect humiliation and suffering. Yet as the train slowed near a sprawling military hospital, a silence fell over the soldiers, heavy with both dread and curiosity. They could see white buildings and orderly grounds through the windows, a stark contrast to the war-torn landscapes they had left behind. Some of the men were too weak to stand. They were carried on stretchers, gaunt and feverish, their uniforms stiff with dried blood. Others hobbled slowly on makeshift crutches, every step a reminder of the wounds they had endured. In their military culture, wounded soldiers were often hidden away, patched up only if resources allowed. The expectation of neglect was ingrained, and yet here, something was already different. As the train doors opened, a group of American medics rushed forward, not with anger or suspicion, but with calm efficiency. They lifted stretchers, checked pulses, and spoke quietly to the men. Every gesture, every word, carried an unspoken message. Your life matters. For the prisoners, this was astonishing. Years of indoctrination had painted the Americans as merciless foes. Yet here they were, treating them not as enemies, but as human beings in need of care. The scene inside the hospital magnified the surprise. Nurses moved with precision and kindness, recording names and injuries, ensuring that dietary and medical needs were met. Surgeons prepared operating rooms as if their patients were comrades rather than captives. A 19-year-old private, his abdomen riddled with shrapnel, was carefully wheeled past fellow prisoners. There was no scorn, no mockery, only calm, professional care. For these men, this contradiction was almost impossible to process. In that moment, the soldiers began to realize that this journey into the unknown might not bring the suffering they had expected. Instead, it would challenge their assumptions, reshape their understanding of the enemy, and leave an impression that would last long after the war. If you want to explore more incredible stories from history like this, do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Every story we share reveals not just events, but the humanity that shines through even the darkest times. As the train came to a gentle halt near the sprawling medical compound, the prisoners hesitated at the doors, unsure of what awaited them beyond the grey metal walls of the cars, their minds still heavy with the expectation of cruelty that had been drilled into them for years. The moment their feet touched the platform, a flurry of activity greeted them, not the harsh barking of orders, nor the jeers of guards anticipating suffering, but a quiet, organized urgency. Men in crisp uniforms moved swiftly between stretchers and wheelchairs, their expressions calm and focused, their hands steady and skilled. What struck the prisoners most was not just the efficiency of the operation, but the unmistakable sense of care that permeated every movement. Here, amidst the bright antiseptic lights of the hospital wards, the world they had known, the one where enemies were treated as expendable, where wounds were ignored or left to fester, seemed to dissolve entirely. Among the medics were soldiers of diverse backgrounds, white and black standing shoulder to shoulder, each performing their duties with equal precision and compassion. To the eyes of the German captives, this scene alone was jarring. Nazi ideology had painted a stark hierarchy of superiority and inferiority. And yet here was a reality that defied every lesson they had been taught. One African-American medic crouched beside a stretcher, carefully drawing blood from an officer who had braced himself for insult or rough treatment, only to find gentle words and meticulous care. The officer's eyes widened, disbelief itched across his face, as the medic adjusted the needle to spare even the smallest sting, his calm voice offering reassurance in English, a language only partially familiar to the patient. This small, almost mundane gesture became a moment of revelation, one that challenged assumptions and forced the men to confront a truth far more disconcerting than any battlefield defeat. Their enemy could act with both strength and empathy. Inside the hospital, the contrast continued to unfold in ways that would leave a lasting imprint on every prisoner who witnessed it. White-coated nurses, some barely older than the young men themselves, moved methodically through the wards, recording vital signs, cataloging injuries, and ensuring that each individual received not only the proper treatment, but also the personal attention to make them feel seen and valued. Surgeons prepared operating theatres with the same meticulous care one would afford a fellow countryman. And when a teenage private, shrapnel lodged deep in his abdomen, was wheeled past, whispers circulated among the prisoners. Will they let him die? Moments later, the doors swung open, and the same young man was under anesthesia, the surgical team moving with a seamless blend of confidence and concern, performing each step as though his life mattered no less than their own. What unsettled the prisoners most profoundly was the quiet normalization of equality and competence across racial lines. In a society where the hierarchy had been rigidly enforced, where black soldiers were often depicted as incapable or inferior, the image of an African-American medic tending carefully to a high-ranking German officer, without hesitation or judgment, defied every lesson the prisoners had internalized. It was not simply a matter of politics or ideology. It was a lived reality that undermined their worldview in the most tangible way. The officer, stiff with suspicion and trained reflexive fear, could only watch as the medic's skilled hands and calm demeanor ensured his safety and comfort. A direct contradiction to the propaganda that had dictated the nature of human relations in the world he knew. As the POWs were guided further into the wards, the environment revealed an astonishing consistency of this human treatment. Meals were prepared with care and distributed generously. Yet the discipline and precision of medical procedures never wavered. Feverish patients were monitored attentively. Wounds were cleaned and dressed meticulously. And even the smallest concerns were addressed with patience. One sergeant, gravely injured in the African campaigns and in desperate need of penicillin, a drug that in Germany had been nearly mythical and reserved for the elite, received the antibiotic without hesitation. The very same hands that had fought against these prisoners now offered life-saving treatment with a calm decisiveness that carried no trace of condescension. For the German captives, each injection, each careful adjustment of a bandage, each quietly delivered word of reassurance became a lesson in the strength of a society that chose mercy over cruelty. The nurses and medics seemed to operate in a rhythm that blended professionalism with humanity. They checked temperatures with precise instruments, offered small comforts when possible, and addressed not only the physical needs but the emotional and psychological states of the men before them. Radios played soft music in the background, a gentle reminder that life continued beyond the confines of war and captivity, while the prisoners, still dazed by the contradiction of their experience, began to perceive the deeper lesson unfolding before them. Here was a society so secure in its own strength that it did not need to punish or humiliate. It could extend care freely and generously, demonstrating power through competence and compassion rather than fear. Even the smallest interactions carried weight. A medic would bend to offer a drink of water, adjust a pillow for comfort, or explain a procedure patiently to a man who did not speak English fluently, each gesture reinforcing the underlying truth. Being treated with dignity did not weaken the Americans. It highlighted their mastery, their confidence, and their humanity. The shock that reverberated through the prisoners was not merely emotional, it was cognitive, reshaping the frameworks through which they understood loyalty, authority, and strength. For many, it was the first moment in the war where they felt entirely unarmed, confronted not by weapons, but by the extraordinary power of compassion executed with precision. In those hospital wards, the German POWs began to confront a new reality. The enemy could fight fiercely, yet act justly. The enemy could be disciplined, yet humane. And, perhaps most unsettling of all, the enemy's care for human life, including their own, was not a weakness, but a measure of true strength. It was here, amidst the careful attention of medics and nurses of all backgrounds, in the quiet efficiency of life-saving procedures, that the prisoners first glimpsed a society where humanity and professionalism coexisted. A revelation that would linger long after the war and echo in their memories as one of the most profound lessons of their captivity. As the weeks passed in the sprawling American hospital and the adjoining camps, the German prisoners began to notice patterns in their daily life that defied every expectation they had carried across the Atlantic. Each morning, the soft light of dawn filtered through clean windows into their dormitory, illuminating neatly made beds, sheets crisp and unwrinkled, blankets folded with precision yet inviting warmth. The prisoners, who had long endured the rough stiffness of canvas cots and the pervasive grime of war-torn encampments, were struck by the sheer orderliness and comfort of their accommodations. There were no crowded bunks with bodies pressed together, no pervasive odors of unwashed clothing or uncleaned floors. Instead, each man had a designated space that he could call his own, a small corner where he could rest, for a fleeting moment, reclaim a sense of dignity that had been stripped from him in the deserts of North Africa. Meals became another revelation, a ritual that reshaped their understanding of sustenance and care. Early on, a tray would arrive at each bedside, not a sparse ration of watery soup or stale bread, as they had been conditioned to expect, but a selection of foods prepared with attention to taste, nutrition, and presentation. Scrambled eggs and crisp bacon sat alongside thick slices of buttered bread, steaming mugs of coffee filled the air with comforting aroma. And fruit, whenever in season, added color and sweetness to the plate. Some men approached the meals cautiously, suspicious of hidden tricks or punishments, but the abundance and care on display quickly quelled any lingering fears. To men who had often gone hungry or survived on meager rations, this sudden generosity was as bewildering as it was profound, a living testament to a society that valued nourishment not as a weapon, but as a gift to restore strength and maintain life. Hygiene, too, became a silent instructor in the principles of order and consideration. Showers were hot, plentiful, and routine, a stark contrast to the infrequent, often improvised attempts at cleanliness in the field. Soap and towels were provided without question, and the men soon realized that cleanliness was not a luxury to be earned or a privilege to be rationed, but a right afforded to all, regardless of the uniform one wore or the flags under which one had fought. Haircuts, dental care, and routine medical checkups became part of the rhythm of life, a structured attentiveness that underscored the value placed on every individual's well-being. These simple acts, washing, grooming, and receiving nutritious meals, were ordinary in the American context, yet extraordinary to the German soldiers who had been taught that the enemy would exploit, neglect, or humiliate them whenever possible. The prisoners began to understand, slowly but unmistakably, that these privileges were not given out of weakness, nor were they meant to undermine discipline or authority. They were manifestations of a confidence that ran deep in the very fabric of American society. A belief that strength was measured not only by the might of weapons or industrial capacity, but by the willingness and ability to sustain life with dignity. Each meal, each neatly made bed, each unhurried bath reinforced a lesson that was subtle yet powerful. A society secure in itself could afford to treat others with care, even when those others had been enemies on the battlefield. Beyond the immediate physical comforts, the daily routines instilled in the prisoners a sense of rhythm and predictability that had been absent from their lives at the front. The structured schedules of meals, hygiene, medical attention, and rest created a sense of order that allowed them to regain mental stability alongside their physical recovery. For many, the shock of this structured generosity was compounded by the fact that they were observed as individuals, rather than as faceless enemies. Medical staff and camp personnel remembered names, inquired about preferences, and ensured that every concern, no matter how small, was addressed with patience. Even dietary restrictions, religious needs, and personal habits were acknowledged and respected. A stark divergence from the strict uniformity and indifference they had known in German military camps. Occasionally, the men would exchange glances at the abundance before them, struggling to reconcile their lived experiences with the images of deprivation and cruelty that had been fed to them for years. One morning, a sergeant carefully lifted a slice of buttered bread, marveled at its weight and texture, and whispered to his neighbor, "This is too much. How can they be so generous?" The neighbor, wiping scrambled eggs from his uniform, simply shook his head, eyes wide with disbelief. These moments, mundane to the American personnel, became transformative for the prisoners, slowly eroding the rigid worldview that had been drilled into them, replacing fear with astonishment and suspicion with reluctant admiration. Even the surroundings of the camp reinforced these lessons. Grounds were clean, buildings maintained, and flowers or small gardens carefully tended, evidence of a society that valued beauty and order alongside function. In the mess halls, tables were laid with care, and the clatter of utensils was accompanied not by barking commands but by polite, patient guidance from servers who treated each man as worthy of respect. The contrast with the chaos and deprivation of war-torn Europe could not have been more pronounced. Every element of daily life, from the bed on which they slept to the meal they consumed, became a living example of a society that measured its strength not only in weapons or manpower, but in its ability to nurture and sustain human life. In these simple, daily routines, comfortable beds, abundant meals, and a hygiene regimen that restored dignity, the German POWs began to grasp the depth of the lesson the Americans were teaching without words. That true power lies in the capacity to care, and that compassion, structure, and generosity can be as disarming and transformative as any victory won on the battlefield. These quiet, almost imperceptible gestures challenged the prisoners' assumptions, planted seeds of reflection, and reshaped their understanding of what it meant to be strong, secure, and humane. Lessons that would resonate long after their captivity ended. As the German prisoners settled into the rhythms of daily life in the American camps, they began to notice a feature of their captivity that challenged every instinct they had been trained to follow, a freedom of choice and responsibility that was entirely foreign to them. In Germany, authority had always been absolute, unchallenged, and unquestionable. Orders were given, obedience demanded, and the consequences of dissent were swift and severe. every movement, every decision, every moment of the day had been dictated by military hierarchy, leaving little room for personal agency or initiative. The very idea that prisoners captives, in the eyes of their own military culture, could participate in governance, plan their own schedules, or organize recreational activities seemed absurd, almost reckless. Yet in the sprawling barracks and open grounds of the American camps, these men discovered precisely that kind of autonomy. Early on, they were informed that the camp would allow them to elect spokesmen to represent their collective interests. These representatives acted as intermediaries between the prisoners and the camp administration, voicing concerns, suggesting improvements, and helping to coordinate daily life. The first elections were tentative, filled with suspicion and uncertainty, as the prisoners struggled to grasp the logic behind granting choice to those who had been captured in battle. Some whispered fears of trickery or hidden control. Yet as the days unfolded, it became clear that the camp officers intended no deception. Their word and their structure offered a genuine trust in the prisoners' capacity to make decisions responsibly, a trust that felt simultaneously liberating and disorienting. With this newfound agency came the ability to organize schedules for work, study, and leisure. Men who had been trained for strict military routines, where every hour was dictated by someone else, suddenly faced the responsibility of planning their own days. Tasks were assigned collectively, yet flexibility allowed for personal initiative. Laboratory work, library study, agricultural labor, and recreational time were all coordinated in consultation with elected representatives, giving the prisoners an unexpected sense of ownership over their lives. For many, the ability to choose when to engage in these activities and how to contribute their skills was not merely practical, it was profoundly empowering. A subtle but transformative lesson in personal responsibility and civic participation. Recreational activities, too, reflected a philosophy entirely at odds with what the men had known. Sports competitions, theatrical performances, music sessions, and craft workshops were encouraged and even supported by the camp administration, allowing prisoners to explore talents, relieve stress, and interact socially without fear of reprisal. Soccer matches across grassy fields became arenas not only of physical exertion but of cooperation, strategy, and camaraderie that transcended national allegiances. Theatre productions staged by the prisoners allowed them to explore creativity and self-expression, drawing applause from fellow inmates and sometimes from American staff, fostering a quiet sense of achievement and pride. For men who had long equated authority with rigidity and punishment, the ability to plan, perform, and manage activities without fear of reprisal was both exhilarating and disconcerting, forcing them to reconsider assumptions about the nature of order, hierarchy, and leadership. The process of self-governance extended even into practical administrative tasks. Prisoners took turns managing mess halls, overseeing supplies, and organizing labor details. They learned to negotiate and collaborate, skills that had little place in the rigid chain of command they had known in Germany. Arguments and disagreements were resolved through discussion, compromise, and consultation with elected representatives, a stark contrast to the authoritarian methods that had governed their former lives. The experience of collective decision-making, where input was valued and outcomes negotiated rather than imposed, offered a window into a society in which power was exercised with restraint and accountability. A concept both alien and awe-inspiring to men who had been taught obedience above all else. Even the smallest freedoms carried profound lessons. Prisoners could choose to spend their free hours reading in well-stocked libraries, practicing crafts, attending lectures, or simply walking across open grounds without fear of arbitrary punishment. These liberties, mundane to the Americans administering the camps, revealed to the prisoners a startling reality: that order and discipline could coexist with personal agency, that structure did not necessitate oppression, and that a society could thrive when individuals were trusted to participate responsibly in its functioning. The combination of responsibility, trust, and structured support created an environment where the prisoners began to internalize principles of democracy and accountability, not through lectures or propaganda, but through lived experience. Over time, the German captives began to notice subtle but undeniable changes in themselves. Where once they had approached every directive with suspicion or rigid compliance, they now engaged in discussion, proposed solutions, and even questioned inefficiencies. The exercise of choice and responsibility sharpened their thinking, encouraged critical reflection, and fostered a sense of community built on mutual respect rather than fear. Bonds formed across barracks, through collaborative projects and shared responsibilities, demonstrating that leadership and cooperation were not exclusive to those in power, but could emerge organically when trust was extended. Perhaps the most striking element of this transformation was its cumulative effect. Men who had entered the camps with deeply entrenched beliefs about authority, obedience, and hierarchy began to experience firsthand that freedom and structure were not mutually exclusive. They discovered that an environment fostering responsibility, participation, and recreation could cultivate resilience, cooperation, and a sense of purpose even in captivity, through the subtle yet pervasive lessons embedded in self-governance. The POWs came to see that strength could be expressed through trust, empathy, and opportunity rather than through fear, punishment, or domination. A revelation that would continue to shape their perspectives long after the war ended and the gates of the camps finally opened. As the German prisoners were escorted across the camp grounds and surrounding towns, their eyes were drawn to a reality that seemed almost dreamlike in its contrast to everything they had been taught and experienced. Civilians moved freely, chatting, laughing, and going about their daily errands with a casual ease that struck the prisoners as entirely foreign. Mothers strolled with children in tow, merchants sold coffee and newspapers openly at street corners, and teenagers lounged near soda fountains without a hint of fear. The prisoners, who had spent years immersed in a culture of vigilance, secrecy, and rigid control, could hardly comprehend such openness. In Germany, the presence of strangers, the sight of ordinary citizens, or even the approach of a local official was often met with caution, suspicion, and disciplined restraint. Here, it seemed, life continued untroubled by war, a vivid display of confidence and stability that both fascinated and unsettled them. More disorienting still was the presence of women in positions of authority and influence. In hospitals, female nurses moved with assured competence, directing care with a mixture of professional rigor and gentle attentiveness. In factories and administrative offices, women oversaw operations, made decisions, and even trained others with a calm authority that commanded respect. For prisoners steeped in Nazi ideology, where women were often portrayed as subordinate or inherently incapable of leadership, the sight of a young woman confidently parking a truck, distributing supplies, or supervising laborers was astonishing. They whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. Some could hardly believe that a woman could exhibit such strength and command without ridicule or interference. It challenged not only their expectations of gender roles, but their understanding of power, hierarchy, and competence itself. Racial integration added another layer of shock and bewilderment. In the American camps, black and white soldiers worked side by side with equal authority, supervising labor, managing resources, and providing medical care without hesitation. German officers, conditioned to view people of African descent as inherently inferior, were forced to take orders from men they had been taught to despise. These interactions were tense at first. Some prisoners stiffened or bristled at instructions, expecting mockery or abuse. Instead, they encountered calm professionalism, fairness, and an unshakable insistence on respect for rules and procedures. The officers soon realized that compliance was not negotiable, yet it was enforced without malice, demonstrating that authority and skill were not bound to race, status, or ideology. In towns and villages near the camps, the prisoners observed everyday life that stood in stark contrast to the controlled, fear-laden environments they had known in Europe. Restaurants, stores, and public buildings were open to all, and interactions among citizens displayed a casual ease that hinted at both personal freedom and societal trust. Black citizens, who had been systematically oppressed in their own country, moved through public spaces with dignity and agency, and their presence in roles of responsibility or visibility did not provoke conflict or ridicule. The prisoners watched in a mix of awe and confusion as Americans of diverse backgrounds shared labor, leisure, and civic life with an unspoken but pervasive expectation of respect and equality. Religious and cultural inclusivity further unsettled the German soldiers' expectations. Jewish prisoners were accommodated without derision, receiving kosher meals and observing rituals without interference. Local communities invited prisoners of various faiths to participate in events, and choirs performed traditional German carols at holiday gatherings, welcoming them as guests rather than captives. Such gestures, steeped in warmth and empathy, directly contradicted the harsh, exclusionary doctrines they had internalized. One officer later recalled the surreal experience of attending a Christmas Eve concert, standing among townspeople whose own children were fighting overseas, and feeling a profound, unsettling sense of gratitude and human connection that challenged the very ideology that had guided his life. The prisoners began to notice the subtler lessons embedded in these encounters. Casual conversations between civilians and guards, laughter shared across racial lines, and women exercising authority all conveyed a social order built not on fear, coercion, or rigid hierarchy, but on mutual respect, trust, and competence. Each observation chipped away at the rigid mental frameworks they had carried, creating space for reflection on what it meant to govern, to lead, and to live in a society where strength was measured not by domination, but by confidence, fairness, and the capacity to nurture and include. As days turned into weeks, the cumulative impact of these observations became increasingly evident. Prisoners who had arrived braced for oppression began to adopt new perspectives, noting how freedom, equality, and order could coexist without descending into chaos. They witnessed a society confident in its own capabilities, unafraid to display its wealth, competence, and civility even to former enemies. Observing women manage hospitals and factories, black soldiers instruct and lead with authority, and civilians navigate their daily lives without fear or constraint. The prisoners were confronted with an alternative vision of society that was simultaneously foreign and deeply compelling. Through these experiences, the German captives began to internalize a profound lesson. True strength did not reside solely in weaponry, propaganda, or rigid discipline, but in a society that extended dignity, opportunity, and equality to all of its members. Each interaction, each observation of openness, competence, and inclusivity challenged their assumptions and reshaped their understanding of human potential, leaving an indelible impression that would linger long after they returned home. A quiet but transformative testament to the power of a society that governed through respect, care, and confidence rather than fear and coercion. As the German prisoners adapted to the routines of camp life and the unexpected freedoms they encountered, they began to notice yet another dimension of their captivity that challenged every assumption they had carried from the front lines. Access to knowledge, ideas, and perspectives that had been systematically denied to them in their homeland. Libraries, stocked with thousands of books that ranged from classic literature to contemporary scientific works, became sanctuaries of thought and curiosity. Men who had once scoffed at decadent or banned authors in Germany now found themselves drawn to the pages of Thomas Mann, Goethe, and Erich Merrier Remarque, immersing themselves in worlds and philosophies they had never dared explore. The act of reading, initially a tentative and cautious pursuit, soon blossomed into a daily ritual, as prisoners sought not only entertainment but understanding, grappling with ideas that questioned authority, morality, and society itself. Beyond the quietude of the library, organized lectures offered another avenue for intellectual expansion. Visiting professors, specialists, and even university faculty traveled to the camps to present lessons in history, mathematics, agriculture, and political theory. Unlike the censored, ideologically filtered education the prisoners had received in Germany, these lectures emphasized critical thinking, debate, and evidence-based reasoning. For the men, this was a revelation. Knowledge was not a tool for indoctrination or control, but a means to understand, analyze, and engage with the world. They began to ask questions they had never permitted themselves to consider, to challenge assumptions, and to discuss perspectives freely among their peers, guided by curiosity rather than fear. Newspapers published within the camps provided yet another window into a society built on openness and transparency. Early editions were understandably cautious, often reflecting lingering sentiments from German propaganda or subtle resistance among some prisoners. But as months passed, the content evolved. Articles discussed democratic principles, labor rights, civic responsibilities, and the functioning of a free press, all without censorship or intimidation. Prisoners who had been taught that dissent was dangerous began to read and reflect, observing that dialogue, criticism, and even humor at the expense of authority figures were not only tolerated but encouraged. These newspapers became catalysts for discussion in mess halls, barracks, and warsites, sparking debates that ranged from the ethics of governance to the practicalities of agriculture, and gradually reshaping the mental landscape of men who had arrived with rigid, dogmatic worldviews. The impact of this intellectual environment was subtle at first, but cumulative and profound. A former officer later recalled being drawn into a debate over labor management and productivity, initially dismissive and defensive, only to realize that his arguments were being evaluated on logic and merit rather than rank or ideology. He was challenged, questioned, and encouraged to reconsider assumptions he had once held as immutable truths. Similarly, prisoners who had never before engaged with democratic concepts found themselves reflecting on the meaning of representation, accountability, and rights, prompted not by coercion but by the structure of the camp itself, which encouraged participation, observation, and dialogue. Even outside formal lectures and library sessions, knowledge was transmitted through everyday interactions and routines. Prisoners observed the consequences of freedom, responsibility, and open discussion in real time, elected representatives managing schedules, work crews negotiating responsibilities, and recreational activities coordinated through consensus rather than command. They saw the practical application of the theories they encountered in books and newspapers, creating a powerful feedback loop that reinforced the lessons of autonomy, fairness, and civic engagement. The juxtaposition of intellectual freedom with structured self-governance allowed them to internalize principles that had previously existed only as abstract concepts. Art, music, and cultural programs further enhanced this exposure to democratic ideas and creative expression. Theater productions allowed prisoners to explore human experience and social commentary through performance, while musical ensembles introduced compositions that had been suppressed under Nazi rule. Painting, sketching, and crafting sessions encouraged individuality and creativity, emphasizing personal expression over conformity. In these activities, the men experienced firsthand the value of choice, initiative, and collaboration, internalizing lessons that were as practical as they were philosophical. The act of creating, interpreting, and performing became a living classroom, where democratic principles and critical thinking were practiced as much as discussed. The intellectual awakening within the camps extended even to discussions of contemporary politics and social structures. Prisoners read, debated, and analyzed policies, laws, and reforms, contrasting them with the authoritarian systems they had once obeyed unquestioningly. The freedom to critique, to explore, and to consider alternative viewpoints was revolutionary, gradually eroding the rigid ideologies instilled by years of propaganda. Men who had once regarded independent thought as dangerous began to appreciate it as a vital skill, recognizing that understanding, dialogue, and reasoning were essential to personal and societal resilience. Ultimately, the combination of uncensored literature, engaging lectures, vibrant newspapers, and experiential learning created a transformation that went far beyond physical comfort or survival. The German prisoners were not only recovering their bodies in American hospitals and camps, but also awakening intellectually and morally, absorbing lessons in democracy, critical thinking, and human dignity that would resonate long after their captivity ended. By experiencing freedom in thought alongside freedom in routine, they discovered that true strength was measured not only by military might but by the capacity to learn, reflect, and grow, and that a society confident in its values could educate, nurture, and transform even those who had once been its enemies. As the months progressed and the German prisoners settled further into camp life, the American administration began integrating them into practical labor programs that extended far beyond the confines of the barracks, opening a new chapter in their captivity that was as instructive as it was surprising. Assigned to work in agriculture and industry, the POWs found themselves shoulder to shoulder with American civilians and soldiers, participating in tasks that were simultaneously demanding, educational, and imbued with an unexpected sense of dignity. For men who had been trained to see authority as absolute and every act of cooperation with perceived inferiors as shameful, these assignments were initially met with skepticism, suspicion, and a quiet resistance that slowly eroded as they experienced the reality of their new environment. In the sprawling fields of Texas, and the Midwest, German prisoners learned to navigate a scale of agricultural labor that dwarfed anything they had known in Europe. Vast tracts of farmland stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with machinery and small reconnaissance planes overhead, surveying herds and crops with a precision that left the prisoners astonished. Unlike the grueling, narrowly regimented work they had endured under the German military, breaks were frequent, meals were ample, and the labor itself was designed for productivity and education rather than punishment. Farmers greeted the prisoners with a mixture of curiosity, patience, and humor, often speaking in broken German or using gestures to communicate, breaking down the barriers imposed by language and ideology. One POW later recalled the simple, human warmth of being offered a cigarette after a long morning in the fields, a gesture meant as camaraderie rather than condescension, and how laughter and shared toil gradually dissolved some of the tension that had defined their arrival. Industrial assignments offered an equally transformative experience. In factories producing aluminum, machinery, and other essential wartime materials, the POWs encountered technologies, processes, and scales of production that were almost unimaginable compared to their previous experiences. They handled equipment and materials with guidance rather than coercion, learning practical skills in metalwork, machinery operation, and maintenance under the watchful yet non-punitive supervision of American foremen. The emphasis was on competence, safety, and collaboration, and the prisoners quickly recognized that their work was valued not as a means of exploitation, but as a contribution to the larger wartime effort. The lessons were both technical and social, teaching the men how efficiency could be paired with respect, labor could be structured yet human, and diverse teams could achieve results far greater than individuals working in isolation. The POWs also began to appreciate the subtle social dynamics of these labor programs. They observed and participated in collaborations that cut across racial and national lines, witnessing Black and white American laborers working seamlessly alongside each other, sometimes directing or instructing German officers whose ideology had previously deemed them inferior. For the prisoners, the reality of competence and authority being divorced from race was profoundly disorienting yet instructive, challenging the deeply ingrained prejudices that had been a cornerstone of their worldview. They discovered that respect was earned through skill, diligence, and cooperation rather than inherited from status or reinforced through fear. A revelation that slowly reshaped their understanding of hierarchy and human interaction. The daily rhythms of work fostered both responsibility and mutual respect. POWs were entrusted with tasks that required initiative, problem solving, and adherence to safety protocols, often with minimal supervision once they had demonstrated competence. Supervisors, rather than imposing authority through intimidation, provided guidance and support, encouraging the prisoners to take ownership of their roles. This approach not only enhanced productivity but cultivated a sense of pride and accomplishment, allowing men who had arrived expecting harsh treatment to experience the dignity of contributing meaningfully to society even while in captivity. Interaction with American workers also offered lessons in cultural and social norms. Prisoners witnessed workplace humor, casual conversations, and the sharing of small courtesies, gestures of humanity that transcended language and nationality. They saw how Americans discussed government policies openly, critiqued leaders without fear, and engaged in civic life with a confidence and openness that was both foreign and inspiring. Observing these norms in practice, the prisoners began to question the rigid hierarchies and ideological constraints that had governed their lives in Germany, realizing that a society could function efficiently and thrive precisely because it encouraged dialogue, respect, and personal initiative. The work programs also provided the POWs with practical skills that would prove valuable beyond the confines of the camp. Agricultural labor taught crop management, soil conservation, animal husbandry, and mechanized farming technique, while industrial assignments imparted expertise in machinery operation, production logistics, and technical problem solving. These experiences broadened their horizons, equipping them with knowledge and capabilities that contrasted sharply with the narrow, militarized training they had received in Germany. More importantly, The work environment modeled a philosophy of mutual accountability and shared purpose, demonstrating that productivity and compassion were not mutually exclusive, and that trust and respect could enhance both efficiency and morale. Through these immersive, hands-on experiences, the German prisoners began to internalize a broader lesson about society, leadership, and human potential. The labor programs showed them that strength was not derived solely from command and coercion, that authority could coexist with empathy and guidance, and that collaboration across differences could yield results far beyond the sum of individual efforts. In the fields, factories, and workshops, they witnessed a living example of a society grounded in confidence, fairness, and inclusivity. And gradually, many came to appreciate that the lessons learned through work were as transformative as those gained in the libraries, lecture halls, and camp administration. By participating in meaningful labor alongside Americans, the POWs experienced firsthand a model of human dignity, cooperation, and skillful engagement that would leave a lasting imprint on their understanding of both their captors and the potential for a freer, more equitable society once they returned home. As the final months of the war drew to a close, the transformation of the German prisoners became increasingly apparent, not only in their physical recovery but in the profound shifts taking place within their minds and hearts. The men who had arrived expecting cruelty, deprivation, and humiliation were now leaving with something far more enduring, a deep and often reluctant admiration for a society that had treated them with dignity, fairness, and an unshakable sense of humanity. What began with astonishment at a medic's care, a nurse's kindness, or a guard's patience had grown into an understanding of the principles that underpinned American life, a recognition that freedom, respect, and opportunity could coexist with discipline, order, and purpose. For many, the most surprising revelation was that true strength was not measured solely by the might of armies, the reach of propaganda, or the efficiency of a military machine, but by the ability of a society to extend compassion even to its enemies. They had witnessed wounded soldiers receiving medical attention equal to that of their captors, with advanced treatments like penicillin administered without hesitation, and they had slept in comfortable beds, eaten nourishing meals, and lived under the same hygiene standards and care as American GIs. These experiences challenged every preconception they had carried from Germany, demonstrating that power need not rely on fear and that mercy could be a form of quiet authority. The impact of education and exposure to uncensored ideas further shaped their perspectives. Prisoners who once adhered rigidly to Nazi ideology found themselves reading literature, engaging in discussions, and attending lectures that questioned the very foundations of authoritarian control and intolerance. The camp libraries, newspapers, and lecture halls had offered lessons in critical thinking, democratic principles, and civic responsibility concepts that were previously foreign or actively suppressed in their homeland. They had learned to debate respectfully, analyze critically, and consider perspectives beyond the rigid hierarchies they had been taught to obey. These lessons, absorbed through both study and observation, lingered long after the final roll call, planting seeds of change that would influence post-war Germany in subtle but meaningful ways. Beyond books and classrooms, the POWs had experienced the practical embodiment of these principles in daily life. They had worked alongside Americans in agriculture and industry, mastering new skills while being treated with respect and fairness. They had observed racial integration in the military and civilian workforce, interactions that defied the prejudices instilled by Nazi propaganda. They had seen women in positions of authority, leading hospitals, managing factories, and flying aircraft with confidence and competence. They had witnessed communities functioning openly, with people free to express opinions, criticize leaders, and engage in public life without fear of retribution. Each of these experiences reinforced the lessons of dignity, equality, and shared responsibility, leaving an indelible mark on the men's understanding of society and power. The emotional and moral resonance of these experiences cannot be overstated. Former POWs later recalled moments that lingered in memory. Townspeople bringing gifts at Christmas, families offering smiles and small kindnesses despite having lost sons in the same conflict, and medics treating wounds with patience and empathy. These acts, often small in isolation, collectively conveyed a powerful message that humanity could transcend enmity, and that the values of a society could be so compelling that even former enemies could recognize and internalize them. Some men admitted that their ideological convictions began to crumble not in battle, but in these quiet, human moments, when the ordinary kindness of strangers illuminated an alternative path for society and governance. When the prisoners were repatriated to Germany, many carried these lessons back with them, not as fleeting memories but as principles that would guide their lives, work, and interactions for decades to come. Letters, memoirs, and interviews reveal a recurring theme: the admiration for the fairness, generosity, and civility of American society, coupled with a recognition of the freedoms and opportunities that had allowed it to flourish. Some applied these lessons in their communities, advocating for education, critical thinking, and democratic engagement. Others chose to return to the United States legally, contributing to industries, communities, and families in ways that reflected the values they had encountered during captivity. For these men, the war's quiet victory lay not on the battlefield, but in the minds and hearts of those who had once considered themselves enemies. This story is a testament to the transformative power of compassion, education, and freedom. It reminds us that even in times of conflict, the treatment of others with respect and humanity can have effects far more enduring than the destruction wrought by weapons. The German POWs were challenged to reconsider everything they had believed about strength, authority, and morality, and in doing so, they experienced a form of victory that required no gunfire, no conquest, only the steadfast demonstration of dignity and fairness. It is a lesson that resonates beyond history, urging us to reflect on how empathy, knowledge, and respect can shape individuals, communities, and nations. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story unfold. If you found this video compelling and insightful, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating historical accounts. Your support helps us bring these transformative stories to life and share the lessons of history that continue to shape our world today. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, sometimes the most profound victories are won not with force, but with humanity.